Okay, so we live in a story. Well then, as soon as you know that, this is what the postmodernists figured out, by the way. This is why the literary critics have become a dominant force in the culture war. The postmodernists were literary critics. You think, well, there's nothing more irrelevant than a literary critic. Like, who the hell cares what an intellectual thinks about a story? I mean, of all the preposterous things to be concerned about, that might top the list. Not if the story is the thing through which you see the world. If the story is the thing you see through which you see the world, there's nothing more powerful than a literary critic, except perhaps an author. And we wouldn't have a culture war right now if the literary critic wasn't far more powerful than anybody had possibly imagined. Because the French intellectual literary critics, known as the postmodernists, have criticized the central story of the West to death. And that's why we have a culture war. And it's no joke. This is foundational. There's no more serious conflict than that. And you all can feel that. That's why you're here. You know that the world is shaking and uncertain in a way that's new. And the reason for that is the story itself is under assault. All right, so let's wander through that a little bit. You see the world through a story. The rationalists or empiricists, even the biologists, they might have an answer to that. They say, okay, fair enough, you see the world through a story, but the story is biologically determined or socio-culturally determined. It's a story of sex, that would be Freud, because for Freud and for Charles Darwin, for that matter, for Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, to an equal degree, the story, the aim is sex, reproduction, and the story is predicated on that aim. Freud, Darwin, Dawkins. The degenerate element of that is a descent into a kind of hedonism. Because if sex is the story, then why not worship sex? And some dispute that and say, no, the central story isn't sex. This would be the Marxists. The central story is power. That's the story that the universities tell when they're not telling the story about sex. It's all about power. The essential human aim is domination, oppression, victimization, exploitation. The central theme of the family is a power dynamic. The central theme of the relationship between men and women is a power dynamic. Marriage itself is a heteronormative, patriarchal establishment of oppression that goes back to the dawn of time. The nuclear family is the same thing. Economic arrangements are nothing but power. Friendships are nothing but power. The landscape of human interaction is a dynamic of power, or sex, or both fighting against one another. Look, these are powerful ideas. Why? Well, it's obvious. Why? I mean, first of all, without sex, there's no reproduction, and without reproduction, there's no people. And so the Darwinian, Freudian, Richard Dawkins selfish gene claim is that, well, what could it possibly be other than sex? And the Marxists come running forward and say, how about power? And then the Marxists say, well, obviously it's power, because there's radical inequality in the world. There's some who have and some who have not. There's no reason to assume that property in the final analysis, let's say, isn't a form of theft, and everyone who has established themselves in some manner has only done that by stealing from those who are powerless and who have less, everything they have, and accruing it to themselves. And that's a credible claim for a variety of reasons. The first, most fundamental reason is that a minority of people have all the success on any possible dimension of comparison. It's a very small number of people who are radically attractive. It's a very small number of people who are radically gifted in the visual arts, let's say. It's a radically small percentage of people who are musicians. A tiny percentage of the people have most of the money. A tiny percentage of the people gather most of the attention. It's a Pareto distribution, and that's what Marx pointed onto. The rich get richer and the poor get poorer. And there's real truth in that, and there's truth in the claim that people structure their relationships with power, and that some people who attain success do it as a consequence of exploitation. And it's equally true that when any human relationship deteriorates, it tends to deteriorate in the relationship of power. If your marriage starts to become shaky, then you begin to exploit each other. Use force. You try to get your way. You try to dominate. It's the same within any family that's deteriorating into a state of pathology. It's the same in any organization. We've seen huge states deteriorate into the tyrannical use of power. If you had to identify a cardinal attribute of mankind, power is a reasonable hypothesis. But let's think about that for a minute. So imagine that, it's sex that is and should be the complete story of mankind. Well, what does that mean exactly? What's a world organized on that basis? What does a world organized on that basis look like? Well, there's nothing more important than sex. Well, how about immediate sexual gratification whenever you want it? How about immediate sexual gratification as the archetype of hedonism? How about immediate sexual gratification whenever you want it, regardless of what anyone else has to say about it? Because if it's the story, and it's the fundamental story, then what stops me from gaining access to what I want right now, regardless of the cost to anyone else? If there's nothing beyond that, if only the naive believe that there's anything noble about humanity beyond the immediate demand of reproduction, then what have you got to say that's moral about sex? And why the hell shouldn't everybody just do exactly what they want, with whoever they want, whenever they want, all the time? And with power, you can make exactly the same argument. And classical societies, aristocratic societies, militaristic and martial societies are predicated on this idea. If I can push you around, all that indicates is that I should push you around, because if you're so weak that I can push you around, you have absolutely no ground whatsoever to stand on to oppose me. Because if you were moral by the traditions of power, I wouldn't be able to push you around. And so it's very difficult to argue out of that from a rational perspective. Why doesn't might make right? And why isn't it only the weak who claim that that's wrong? And why isn't it only that the weak claim that that's wrong, not because they're moral, but because they're weak? That would certainly be a spin-off on the Nietzschean notion that will to power constitutes the core of man. And I would say, up until the dawn of Judeo-Christian ethic, let's say, power ruled. And then we could imagine what sort of world it's like when power rules. Well, we know what that world's like. It's like pay attention to the strongest or suffer the consequences. Well, is there something beyond that? That's not mere naivety. If it isn't power that's the story, and if it isn't sex that's the story, what's the story? For the West, the answer to that is the library of the Bible. That's the story. It's the story upon which the West is founded. It's the story that has arisen over thousands of years, tens of thousands of years for that matter, attempting to address the core issue. What's the fundamental story? It's no mystery to make the claim that the claim of the biblical library of stories, because it is a library, is that it's the fundamental story. All right, so we live in a story. We've identified the competitors, power and sex. What is it that's being expressed in the biblical story? Look, if you go to a movie or read a complex book, you go to a sophisticated movie, a sophisticated play, a Shakespearean play, or you read a sophisticated work of fiction, you see a multidimensional characterization, right? A comic book has a hero with one motive. A sophisticated work of fiction has a hero, and perhaps an anti-hero, with complex, multidimensional motivations. Whatever characterizes those more realistic people isn't reducible to any single attribute. And in a complicated work of fiction, the author walks you through a multidimensional characterization. You see the same person, the hero, aiming upward, the anti-hero or villain aiming downward. You see that person portrayed in multiple different situations. And pursuing partial reflections of their ultimate aim. And in consequence of that, you learn to understand and embody that complex of aims. When you see a movie and you watch the hero, you're watching the hero to learn how to act like a hero. When you're watching a movie and you watch the anti-hero or the villain, you're watching the movie to learn how not to fail catastrophically and land in hell while taking everyone else along with you. Is it reducible to something as simple as power or sex? Not if it's not a comic book. You need a multidimensional characterization. All right. The biblical corpus provides a multidimensional characterization of the fundamental aim of man and cosmos. That's the claim of the book. So I'm going to walk you through some of the stories and show you what's being revealed. What's being revealed is the proper object of worship. Okay, so what does that mean? The proper object of celebration. The aim towards which all sacrifices and work are to be directed. That which should be held in the highest regard. That which should be imitated in ritual and admiration. Okay, so that's the idea. Admiration in the same way that a small child who hero worships the boy down the street who's the baseball star, because that boy portrays a pattern of skill and attention that is the next appropriate developmental step for the hero worshiping child. That's a recreation of the religious impulse. The impulse to look up, admire, and imitate. The question being, to what should we address our attention, upward looking, admire, and imitate? That highest possible object of apprehension and admiration is by definition God. It's a definition. It's the highest aim that lurks behind all proximal aims. That's a good way of thinking about it.